And in this segment, we're going to continue our reading or narration of the history of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. So let's jump right in. Brilliant Success of the Hussites, Chapter 17 of Book 3rd, John Huss and the Hussite Wars. So we're coming to the end of this book, Book 3rd. And perhaps we'll get through it today, depending on how long these chapters are. These were substantially the same as the 4 articles mentioned in a former chapter, and which the Hussites, when the struggle opened, had agreed on as the indispensable basis of all negotiations for peace that might at any time be entered upon, namely, the free preaching of the gospel. These were their demands. Communion in both kinds. And in both kinds means that they get the cup and the bread. And of course, you know, in the Roman Church, the cup is reserved only for the priests in the hierarchy, and the lay people only get the wafer, or which they have for bread. So communion in both kinds. And as we discovered earlier, that the cup was a symbol for the nation, and a symbol of this, the communion in both kinds. They get the cup too. Just as Christ commanded, do this in remembrance of me. He didn't say, do half of this in remembrance of me. I guess that would be the point. Also, a satisfactory arrangement of the ecclesiastical property, and the execution of the laws against all crimes by whomsoever committed. The likelihood was small that so bigoted a monarch as Sigismund would agree to these terms. But though the journey had been 10 times longer, and the chances of success 10 times smaller, Procopius would have done what he did if thereby he might bind up his country's wounds. It was as might have been anticipated. Sigismund would not listen to the voice of a suffering but magnanimous and pious people, and Procopius returned to Prague, his embassy unaccomplished, but with the satisfaction that he had held out the olive branch, and that if the sword must again be unsheathed, the blood which would flow would lie at the doors of those who had spurned the overtures of a just and reasonable peace. The Hussites now assumed the offensive, and those nations which had so often carried war into Bohemia experienced its miseries on their own soil. This policy might appear to the Bohemians, on a large view of their affairs, the wisest that they could pursue. We know at least that it was adopted at the recommendation of the enlightened and patriotic man who guided their counsels. The overtures for peace had been haughtily rejected, and it was now manifest that they could reckon on not a day's tranquility, save in the way of an unconditional surrender of their crown to the emperor, and an unequally unconditional surrender of their conscience to the Pope. Much as they loved peace, they were not prepared to purchase it at such a price, and instead of waiting until the war should come to them, they thought it better to anticipate it by carrying it into the countries of their enemies. Procopius entered Germany, 1429, at the head of 80,000 warriors, and in the campaign of that and the following summers he carried his conquests from the gates of Magdeburg in the north to the further limits of Franconia in the south. The whole of western Germany felt the weight of his sword. Some 100 towns and castles he converted into ruins. He exacted a heavy ransom from the wealthy cities, and the barons and bishops he made to pay sums equally large as the price of their escape from captivity or death. Such towns as Bamberg and Nuremberg, and such magnates as the Elector of Brandenburg and the Bishop of Salzburg, were rated each at 10,000 ducats. It was an enormous sum at the time, when the gold-yielding countries were undiscovered, and the affluence of their mines had not cheapened the price of the precious metals in the markets of Europe. The return homeward of the army of Procopius was attended by 300 wagons, which groaned under the weight of the immense booty that he carried with him on his march back to Bohemia. We record this invasion without either justifying or condemning it. Were we to judge of it, we should feel bound to take into account the character of the age and the circumstance of the men. The Bohemians were surrounded by nationalities who bitterly hated them and who would not be at peace with them. They knew that their faith made them the objects of incessant intrigues. They had it in their choice, they believed, to inflict these ravages or to endure them, and seeing war there must be, they preferred that it should be abroad, not at home. But we submit that the lasting tranquility and the higher interests of the nation might have been more effectually secured in the long run by a policy directed to the intellectual, the moral, and especially the spiritual elevation of Bohemia. The heroism of a nation cannot be maintained apart from its moral and spiritual condition. The seat of valor is the conscience. Conscience can make the man a coward, or it can make him a hero. Living as the Hussites did in the continual excitement of camps and battles and victories, it could not be but their moral and spiritual life should decline. If confiding in that arm which had hitherto so wonderfully guarded their land, which had given them victory on a score of battlefields, and which had twice chased their enemies from their soil when they came against them in overwhelming numbers, if, we say, leaning on that arm, they had spread not their swords, but their opinions over Germany, they would have taken the best of all revenges, not on the Germans only, but on her whose seat was on the 7 hills, and who had called up and directed against their nation all those terrible tempests that had burst one after the other over it. These are the invasions which Rome dreads most. Is it not men clad in mail, but men clad in the armor of truth, wielding not the sword, but the Scriptures, before whom Rome trembles? But we must recall our canon of criticism and judge the Hussites by the age in which they lived. It was not their fault if the 15th century did not put them in possession of that clear, well-defined system of truth, and of those great faculties for spreading it over the earth, which the 19th has put within our reach. Their piety and patriotism, as a principle, may have been equal, nay, superior to ours, but the ethical maxims which regulate the display of these virtues were not then so fully developed. Procopius, the great leader of the Bohemians, lived in an age when missions were yet remote. There was a trembling through all Germany. Alarm was felt even at Rome, for the Hussites had made their arms the terror of all Europe. The Pope and the Emperor took counsel how they might close a source of danger which threatened to devastate Christendom, and which they themselves in an evil hour had opened. They convoked a diet at Nuremberg. There it was resolved to organize a new expedition against Bohemia. The Pope, not Martin V, who died of apoplexy on the 20th of February, 1431, but Eugenius IV, who succeeded him on the 16th of March, proclaimed through his legate, Cardinal Julian Cesarini, a 5th crusade. No ordinary advantages were held forth as inducements to embark in this most meritorious but hazardous service. Persons under a vow of pilgrimage to Rome, or to St. James of Compostela in Spain, might have release on condition of giving the money they would have spent on their journey to aid in the war. Nor were rewards wanting to those who, though unable to fight, were yet willing to pray. Intending crusaders might do shrift for half a Bohemian penny, nor need the penitent pay even this small sum unless he chose. Confessors were appointed to give absolution of even the most heinous crimes, such as burning churches and murdering priests. that the crusader might go into the battle with a clear conscience. And verily he had need of all these aids to fortify him, when he thought of those with whom he was about to join battle. For every Hussite was believed to have within him a legion of fiends. And it was no light matter to meet a foe like this, but whatever might happen, the safety of the crusader had been cared for. If he fell in battle, he went straight to paradise, and if he survived, there waited him a paradise on earth, in the booty he was sure to reap in the Bohemian land, which would make him rich for life. Besides these spiritual lures, the feeling of exasperation was kept alive in the breasts of the Germans by the memorials of the recent Hussite invasion still visible on the face of the country. Their ravaged fields and ruined cities continually in their sight whetted their desire for vengeance. Besides, German valor had been sorely tarnished by defeat abroad and by disaster at home, and it was not wonderful that the Teutons should seize this chance of wiping out these stains from the national shield. Accordingly, every day new troops of crusaders arrived at the place of rendezvous, which was the city of Nuremberg, and the army now assembled there numbered, horse and foot, 130,000 men. On the 1st of August, 1431, the Crusaders crossed the Bohemian frontier, penetrating through the great forest which covered the country on the Bavarian side. They were brilliantly led as concerned rank, for at their head marched quite a host of princes, spiritual and temporal. Chief among these was the legate Julian Cesarini. The very Catholic Cochleus hints that these cardinals and archbishops might have found worthier employment, and he even doubts whether the practice of priests appearing in mail at the head of armies can be justified by the Levites of old, who were especially exempt from serving in arms that they might wholly attend to their service in the tabernacle. The feelings of the Hussites, as day by day they received tidings of the numbers, equipment, and near approach of the hosts, we can well imagine. Clouds as terrible as ere this darkened their sky, but they had seen an omnipotent hand suddenly disperse them. They were prepared, as aforetime, to stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of their country and their faith, but any army they should hope to bring into the field would not amount to half the number of that which was now marching against them. They reflected, however, that victory did not always declare on the side of the largest battalions, and, lifting their eyes to heaven, they calmly awaited the approach of the foe. The invading host advanced, chanting triumph before victor, says L'Enfant, and arriving at Tachau, it halted there a week. Nothing could have better suited the Bohemians. Forming into 3 columns, the invaders moved forward. Procopius fell back on their approach, sowing reports as he retreated that the Bohemians had quarreled among themselves and were fleeing. His design was to lure the enemy farther into the country and fall upon him on all sides. On the morning of the 14th of August, the Bohemians marched to meet the foe. That foe now became aware of the stratagem which had been practiced upon him. The terrible Hussite soldiers, who were believed to be in the fight, were advancing to offer battle. The enemy were encamped near the town of Reisenberg. The Hussites were not yet in sight, but the sounds of their approach struck upon the ear of the Germans. The rumble of their wagons and their war hymn chanted by the whole army as it marched bravely forward to battle were distinctly heard. Cardinal Cesarini and a companion climbed a little hill to view the impending conflict. Beneath them was the host which they expected soon to see engaged in victorious fight. It was an imposing spectacle. This great army of many nationalities, with its waving banners, its mail-clad knights, its helmeted cavalry, its long lines of wagons, and its numerous artillery, The cardinal and his friend had gazed only a few minutes when they were startled by a strange and sudden movement in the host. As if smitten by some invisible power, it appeared all at once to break up and scatter. The soldiers threw away their armor and fled, one this way, another that, and the wagoners emptied their vehicles of their loads, set off across the plain at full gallop. Struck with a consternation and amazement, the cardinal hurried down to the field and soon learned the cause of the catastrophe. The army had been seized with a mysterious panic. That panic extended to the officers equally with the soldiers. The Duke of Bavaria was one of the first to flee. He left behind him his carriage, in the hope that its spoil might tempt the enemy to delay their pursuit. Behind him, also in inglorious flight, came the Elector of Brandenburg, and following close on the Elector were others of less note, chased from the field by this unseen terror. The army followed, if that could be styled an army, which so lately had been a marshalled and bannered host, but was now only a rabble of rout, fleeing when no man pursued. To do him justice, the only man who did not lose his head that day was the papal legate, Caesarini. Amazed, mortified, and indignant, he took his stand in the path of the crowd of fugitives, in the hope of compelling some of them to stand and show fight. He addressed them with the spirit of a soldier, bidding them to remember the glory of their ancestors. If their pagan forefathers had shown such courage in lighting for dumb idols, surely it became their descendants to show at least equal courage in fighting for Christ and the salvation of souls. But deeming, it may be, this style of argument too high-pitched for the men and the occasion, the cardinal pressed upon the terrified crowd the more prudential and practical consideration that they had a better chance of saving their lives by standing and fighting than by running away, that they were sure to be overtaken by the light cavalry of the Bohemians, and that the peasantry, whose anger they had incurred by the pillage and slaughter they had inflicted in their advance, would rise upon them and cut them down in their flight. With these words he succeeded in rallying some bodies of the fugitives. But it was only for a few minutes. They stood their ground only until the Bohemians were within a short distance of them, and then that strange terror again fell upon them, and the stampede, to use a modern phrase, became so perfectly uncontrollable that the legate himself was borne away in the current of bewildered and hurrying men. Much did the cardinal leave behind him in his enforced flight. First and chiefly, he lost that great anticipated triumph of which he had been so sure. His experience in this respect was precisely that of another cardinal legate, his predecessor, Henry de Beaufort. It was a rude awakening in which he opened his eyes, not on glorious victory, but on humiliating and bitter defeat. Caesarini incurred other losses on this fatal field. He left behind him his hat, his cross, his bell, and the Pope's bull proclaiming the crusade, that same crusade which had come to so ridiculous a termination. The booty was immense. Wagon loads of coins, destined for the payment of troops, became now the property of the Bohemians, beside the multifarious spoil of the field, artillery, arms, banners, dresses, gold and silver plate, and utensils of all kinds, and, adds the old chronicler, with a touch of humor, many wagons of excellent wine. This was now the second time the strange phenomena of panic had been repeated in the Hussite wars. The Germans are naturally brave. They have proved their valor on 100 fields. They advanced against the Bohemians in vastly superior numbers, and if panic there was to be, we should have rather looked for it in the little Hussite army. When they saw the horizon filled with Germans, foot and horse, it would not have been surprising if the Bohemians had turned and fled. But that the Germans should flee is explicable only with reference to the moral state of the combatants. It shows that a good conscience is the best equipment of any army, and will do much to win victory. But there is something more in the facts we have related than the courage inspired by the consciousness of a good cause, and the feebleness and cowardice engendered by the consciousness of a bad one. There is here the touch of a divine finger, the infusion of a preternatural terror. So great was the stupefaction with which the Crusaders were smitten, that many of them, instead of continuing their flight into their own country, wandered back into Bohemia, while others of them, who reached their homes in Nuremberg, did not know their native city when they entered it, and began to beg for lodgings as if they were among strangers. Chapter 18. The Council of Basle. Negotiations. Council of Basle. Hussites invited to the council. Entrance of Hussite deputies into Basle. Their 4 articles. Debates in the council. No agreement. Return of the deputies to Prague. Resumption of negotiations. The Compactada. Its equivocal character. Sigismund accepted as king. Arms which had served the cause of Rome so ill were now laid aside, and in their room resort was had to wiles. It was now evident that those great armaments raised and fitted out at an expense so enormous, and one after another launched against Bohemia, a little country, but peopled by heroes, were accomplishing no end at all, save that of fattening with corpses and enriching with booty the land they were meant to subdue. There were other considerations which recommended a change of policy on the part of the imperial and ecclesiastical powers. The victorious Hussites were carrying the war into the enemy's country. They had driven the Austrian soldiers out of Moravia. They had invaded Hungary and other provinces, burning towns and carrying off booty. These proceedings were not without their effect in opening the eyes of the Pope and the Emperor to the virtue of conciliation, to which they now had been blind. In the year 1432, they addressed letters to the Bohemians, couched in the friendliest terms, and evidently designed to open the way to peace, and to give the Emperor quiet possession of the kingdom in which, as he said, he was born, and over which his father, brother, and uncle had reigned. Not otherwise than as they had reigned would he reign over them, should they permit him peaceably to enter. So he promised. A general council of the Church had been convoked and was now in session in Basle, on the frontier between Germany and Switzerland. Washed by the Rhine, skirted on the east by the hills of the Black Forest, while in the southern horizon appear the summits of the Jura Alps, is situated the pleasant town where the council was now assembled, and where a century later the seeds of the Reformation found a congenial soil. Letters from the Emperor and the legate Julian invited the Bohemians to come to Basle and confer on their points of difference. To induce them to accept his invitation, the fathers offered them a safe conduct to and from the council, and a guarantee for the free celebration of their worship during their stay, adding the further assurance that the council would lovingly and gently hear their reasons. The Hussites were not at all sanguine that the result of the conference would be such as would enable them to sheathe the sword over a satisfactory arrangement of their affairs. They had doubts, too, touching their personal safety. Still, the matter was worth a good deal of both labor and risk, and after deliberating, they resolved to give proof of their desire for peace by attending the council. They chose deputies to represent them at Basle, of whom the chief was Procopius the Great, William Haska, Baron of Poskopis, a valiant knight, John Huxana, preacher of Prague, and Nicholas Gallicus, pastor of the Taborites. They were accompanied by Peter Payne, an Englishman, of excellent prompt and pregnant wit, and who did good service at Basle. A company of 300 in all set out on horseback for the council. The arrival of the Bohemian deputies was looked forward to with much interest in the Swiss town. The prodigies recently enacted upon its soil had made Bohemia a land of wonders, and very extraordinary pictures indeed had been circulated of the men by whom the victories with which all Europe was now ringing had been won. The inhabitants of Basle waited their arrival half in expectation, half in terror, not knowing whether they were heroes or monsters whom they were about to receive into their city. At length their approach was announced. All the inhabitants of Basle turned out to see those men whose tenets were so abominable and whose arms were so terrible. The streets were lined with spectators. Every window and roof had a cluster of eager and anxious sightseers, and even the venerable fathers of the council mingled in the crowd, that they might have an early view of the men whom they were to meet in theological battle. As the cavalcade crossed the long wood bridge that spans the Rhine, and slowly climbed the opposite bank, which is crowned with the cathedral towers and other buildings of the city, its appearance was very imposing. The spectators missed the teeth of the lions and eyes of demons, with which the Hussites were credited by those who had fled before them on the battlefield. But they saw in them other qualities which, though less rare, were more worthy of admiration. Their tall figures and gallant bearing, their faces scarred with battle, and their eyes lit with courage, were the subject of general comment. Procopius drew all eyes upon him. "This is the man," they said one to another, "who has so often put to flight the armies of the faithful, who has destroyed so many cities, who has massacred so many thousands, the invincible, the valiant." The deputies had received their instructions before leaving Prague. They were to insist on the 4 following points, which, as already mentioned, formed the prearranged basis on which alone the question of a satisfactory adjustment of affairs could be considered, as the indispensable conditions of peace. 1. The free preaching of the word. 2. The right of the laity to the cup, and the use of the vernacular tongue in all parts of divine worship. 3. The ineligibility of the clergy to secular office and rule. And 4. The execution of the laws in the case of all crimes without respect of persons. Accordingly, when the deputies appeared before the council, they made the fathers aware that their deliberations must be confined to these 4 points, that these were the faith of the Bohemian nation, that that nation had not empowered them to entertain the question on a renunciation of that faith, but only to ascertain how far it might be possible, in conformity with the 4 articles specified, to arrange a basis of peace with the Church of Rome, and permit a Roman Catholic sovereign to wear the crown of Bohemia, and that they had appeared in the council not to discuss with it generally the tenets of Huss and Rome. These 4 articles may be said to have formed the new constitution of the kingdom of Bohemia. They struck at the foundation of the Roman hierarchy, and implied a large measure of reformation. The eventual consolidation of the nation's civil and religious liberties would have been their inevitable result. The supreme authority of the Scriptures, which the Hussites maintained, implied the emancipation of the conscience, the beginning of all liberty. The preaching of the gospel and the celebration of public worship in the language of the people implied the purification of the nation's morals and the enlightenment of the national intellect. Communion in both kinds was a practical repudiation of the doctrine of the Mass, for to insist on the cup as essential to the sacrament is tacitly to maintain that the bread is simply bread, and not the literal flesh of Christ, and the articles which disqualified priests from civil rule displaced them from the state offices which they filled, and subjected them to the laws in common with others. This article struck at the idea that the priesthood forms a distinct and theocratic kingdom. The 4 articles as they stand, it will be observed, lie within the sphere of administration. They do not include any one principle fundamentally subversive of the whole scheme of Romanism. In this respect, they fall short of Wycliffe's program, which preceded them, as well as of Luther's, which came after. In Bohemia, the spiritual and intellectual forces are less powerfully developed. The patriotic and the military are in the ascendant. Still, it is to be borne in mind that the Bohemians had acknowledged the great principle that the Bible is the only infallible authority, and where this principle is maintained and practically carried out, there the fabric of Romanism is undermined. Put the priest out of court as an infallible oracle, and the Bible comes in his room. And the moment the Word of God enters, the shackles of human authority and tradition fall off. Cardinal Julian, the papal legate, opened the proceeding with a long and eloquent oration on the conciliatory character. He exhorted the delegates of Bohemia, says Fox, to unity and peace, saying that the Church was the spouse of Jesus Christ and the mother of all the faithful, that it hath the keys of binding and loosing, and also that it is white and fair, and without spot and wrinkle, and that it cannot err in those points necessary to salvation. He exhorted them also to receive the decrees of the council, and to give no less credit unto the council than to the gospel, by whose authority the Scriptures themselves are received and allowed. Also that the Bohemians, who call themselves the children of the Church, ought to hear the voice of their mother, who is never unmindful of her children, that in the time of Noah's flood, as many as were without the ark perished, that the Lord's Passover was to be eaten in one house, that there was no salvation to be sought for out of the church, and that this is the famous garden and fountain of water, whereof whosoever shall drink shall not thirst everlastingly, that the Bohemians have done as they ought, in that they have sought the fountains of this water at the council, and have now at length determined to give ear unto their mother. The Bohemians made a brief reply, saying that they neither believed nor taught anything that was not founded on the Word of God, that they had come to the council to vindicate their innocence in open audience, and ended by laying on the table the 4 articles they had been instructed to insist on as the basis of peace. Each of these 4 articles became in its turn the subject of discussion. Certain of the members of council were selected to impugn, and certain of the Bohemian delegates were appointed to defend them. The fathers strove, not without success, to draw the deputies into a discussion on the wide subject of Catholicism. They anticipated, it may be, an easy victory over men whose lives had been passed in the battlefield, for if the Hussites were foiled in the general argument, they might be expected to yield more easily on the 4 points especially in debate. But neither on the wider field of Catholicism nor on the narrower ground of the 4 articles did the Bohemians show any inclination to yield. Wherever they had learned their theology, they proved themselves as obstinate combatants in the general chamber as they had done on the field of battle. They could marshal arguments and proofs as well as soldiers, and the fathers soon found that Rome was likely to win as little fame in this spiritual contest as she had done in her military campaigns. The debates dragged on through 3 tedious months, and at the close of that period the council was as far from yielding the Hussite articles, and the delegates were as far from being convinced that they ought to refrain from urging them, as they had been on the first day of the debate. This was not a little mortifying to the fathers, all the more so that it was the reverse of what they had confidently anticipated. The Hussites, they thought, might cling to their errors in the darkness that brooded over the Bohemian soil, But at Basle, in the presence of the polemical giants of Rome, and amidst the blaze of an ecumenical council, that they should continue to maintain them was not less a marvel than a mortification to the council. Procopius especially bore himself gallantly in this debate. A scholar and a theologian, as well as a warrior, the fathers saw with mingled admiration that chagrin he could wield his logic with not less dexterity than his sword, and could strike as heavy a blow on the ecclesiastical arena as on the military. "You hold a great many heresies," said the papal legate to him one day. "For example, you believe that the mendicant orders are an invention of the devil." If Procopius grant this, doubtless, thought the legate, he will mortally offend the council, and if he deny it, he will scandalize his own nation. The legate waited to see on which horn the leader of the Taborites would do penance. "Can you show," replied Procopius, "that the mendicants were instituted by either the patriarchs or the prophets under the Old Testament, or Jesus Christ and the apostles under the New? If not, I ask you, by whom were they instituted?" We do not read that the legate pressed the charge further. After 3 months' fruitless debates, the Bohemian delegates left Basle and returned to their own country. The council would come to no terms unless the Bohemians would engage to surrender the faith of Huss and submit unconditionally to Rome. Although the Hussites, vanquished and in fetters, had been prostrate at the feet of the council, it could have proposed nothing more humiliating. The council forgot that the Bohemians were victorious, and that it was it that was suing for peace. In this light, it would seem, did the matter appear to the members when the deputies were gone, for they sent after them a proposal to renew at Prague the negotiations, which had been broken off at Basle. Shrinking from the dire necessity of again unsheathing the sword, and anxious to spare their country the calamities that attended even victorious warfare, the Bohemian chiefs returned answer to the council, bidding them send forward their delegates to Prague. Many an armed embassy had come to Prague, or as near to it as the valor of its heroic sons would permit. Now messengers of peace were traveling toward the land of John Huss. "Let us," said the Bohemians, "display as great courtesy and respect on this occasion as we have shown bravery and defiance on the former ones." The citizens put on their best clothes. The bells were tolled. Flags were suspended from the steeples and ramparts on the gates, and every expression of public welcome greeted the arrival of the delegates of the council. The Diet of Bohemia was convoked, 1434. With reference to the question which was about to be reopened, the negotiations proceeded more smoothly on the banks of the Moldau than they had done on those of the Rhine. The negotiations ended in a compromise. It was agreed that the 4 articles of the Hussites should be accepted, but that the right of explaining them, or of determining their precise import, should belong to the council. In other words, the Pope and the Emperor. Such was the treaty now formed between the Roman Catholics and the Hussites. Its basis was the 4 articles explained by the council. Obviously an arrangement which promised a plentiful crop of misunderstandings and quarrels in the future. To this agreement was given the name of the Compactata. As with the Bible, so with the 4 Hussite articles. Rome accepted them, but reserved to herself the right of determining their true sense. Rome accepted them, but reserved to herself the right of determining their true sense. It might have been foreseen that the interpretation and not the articles would henceforth be the rule. So was the matter understood by Silvius, an excellent judge of what the council meant. "This formula of the council," said he, "is short, but there's more in its meaning than in its words. It banishes all such opinions and ceremonies as are alien to the faith, and it takes the Bohemians bound to believe and to maintain that all the Church Catholic believes and maintains. This was said with special reference to the Council's explication of the Hussite article of the communion in both kinds. The administrator was to teach the recipient of the Eucharist according to the decree of the Council in its 13th session, that the whole Christ was in the cup as well as in the bread. This was a covert reintroduction of transubstantiation. The Compactata, then, was but a feeble guarantee to the Bohemian faith and liberties. In fact, it was a surrender of both, and thus the Pope and the Emperor, defeated on so many bloody fields, triumphed at last on that of ordinary diplomacy. Many of the Bohemians, and more especially the party termed the Calixtines, now returned their obedience to the Roman See, the cup being guaranteed to them, and the Emperor Sigismund was now acknowledged as legitimate sovereign of Bohemia. Chapter 19. Last Scenes of the Bohemian Reformation. The two parties, Calixtines and Taborites. The Compactata, accepted by the first, rejected by the second. War between the two. Death of Procopius. Would the Bohemian Reformation have regenerated Christendom? Sigismund violates the Compactata. He dies. His character. George Podiebrad, elected king. The Taborites, visited by Aeneas Sylvius. Their persecutions. A Taborite ordination. Multiplication of their congregations. The Bohemians were now divided into two strongly marked and widely separated parties, the Taborites and the Calixtines. This division had existed from the first, but it widened in proportion as the strain of their great struggle was relaxed. The party that retained most of the spirit of John Huss were the Taborites. With them, the defense of their religion was the first concern, that of their civil rights and privileges the second. The latter deemed perfectly safe under the aegis of the former. The Calixtines, on the other hand, had become lukewarm so far as the struggle was one for religion. They thought that the rent between their country and Rome was unnecessarily wide, and their policy was now one of approximation. They had secured the cup, as they believed, not reflecting that they had got transubstantiation along with it, and now the conflict, they thought, should cease. To the party of the Calixtines belonged the chief magnates and most of the great cities, which threw the preponderance of opinion on the side of the Compactata. Into this scale was thrown also the influence of Roxana, the pastor of the Calixtines. He was tempted with the hope of a bishopric, says Comenius, and used his influence both at Basle and Prague to further conciliation on terms more advantageous to Rome than honorable to the Bohemians. In this manner, says Comenius, they receded from the footsteps of Huss and returned to the camp of Antichrist. In judging of the conduct of the Bohemians at this crisis of their affairs, we are to bear in mind that the events narrated took place in the 15th century, that the points of difference between the two churches, so perfectly irreconcilable, had not yet been so clearly and sharply defined as they came to be by the great controversies of the century that followed. But the Bohemians, in accepting this settlement, stepped down from a position of unexampled grandeur. Their campaigns are amongst the most heroic and brilliant of the wars of the world. A little country and a little army, they nevertheless were at this hour triumphant over all the resources of Rome and all the armies of the empire, that they had but to keep their ground and remain united, and to take care that their patriotism, kindled at the altar, did not decline. and there was no power in Europe that would not have dared attack them. From the day that the Bohemian nation sat down on the Compactata, their prestige waned. They gained no more victories, and the tone of public feeling and the tide of national prosperity began to go back. The Calixtines accepted, the Taborites rejected this agreement. Okay, well, I'm running out of time, so that's going to be where we're going to have to leave it off. Anyway, we're going through, in case anybody wonders what they're hearing, is the history of Protestantism, and this is the very last chapter, which we will finish in our next session. The very last chapter of Book 3rd, John Huss and the Hussite Wars. The Bohemian nation, where I believe Czechoslovakia, is that right? Yeah. The Czechs in former times. And we will, without doubt, begin our next book, 4th, which is Christendom at the opening of the 16th century, next time, as soon as we finish that last chapter next time. But I have run out of time, so may the Almighty bless you all and keep you all as we travel on the narrow way that leads to life. I will see you next time. Secrets of the Rapture. Is there a 500-year-old conspiracy? A propaganda machine so pervasive and entrenched, yet so elusive that the entire world could be taken in by it, working in plain sight, but unseen by the world for what it truly is? If prophecy is God-given history in advance, why does the prophecy that has conquered the age also exclude nearly 2,000 years of history? What is it that they are afraid that the light of history will reveal? To understand our place in time and prophecy, we must look in history for an interpretation, that which stands the test of time, that which agrees with the Word of God, and history has proven to be true. When cunning fables and fearful speculations are removed from our sight, then we may clearly see what is truly expressed in Bible prophecy, both that which has been fulfilled and that which has yet to come. God's express word is the sword that must be wielded to remove the scales from the eyes and dispel the darkness of deceitful conjecture. Secrets of the Rapture was written to expose that which the spirit of the age has conjured out of the darkness to blind the eyes of the church in the world today. Secrets of the Rapture, Deconstructing Pre-Tribulation Dispensational Futurism by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur, is now available at lulu.com and Amazon. Secrets of the Rapture. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOPI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.